I never stopped loving her. The words slipped out of Yaman's mouth during an interview that no one expected to turn emotional. The confident, composed man the world knows suddenly seemed vulnerable. For a moment, his strong facade cracked, revealing the truth many had suspected but never heard him admit out loud. Fans who have followed Can's journey from his early TV days to becoming an international star know that behind his intense charisma, there has always been a story that remained unfinished, a love that refused to fade. And when he said those 6 words, "I never stopped loving her," it was as if the years of silence finally broke open. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. The tension between Can and his ex had always fascinated the public. Their chemistry on set was undeniable, their connection off-screen too powerful to be just acting. 4 months after their breakup, he tried to convince the world, and maybe himself, that he had moved on. He dated other people, he traveled, he buried himself in work. Yet, somehow, his eyes always gave away something his words couldn't hide. When the interviewer mentioned her name, there was a pause, a heavy silence that filled the room. Then, a small smile appeared on his face, not of joy, but of remembrance. He looked down for a second before saying quietly, "Some loves don't end, they just learn to live in silence." Those in the studio said the atmosphere changed completely. The man who once guarded his heart so carefully began to open up, revealing the emotional scars of a love story that shaped him more than any role ever could. "I think," he continued, "when you truly love someone, a part of you always stays with them. Even if life takes you in different directions, that connection, it never really goes away." The confession spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with clips, fans posting side-by-side photos, comparing his words with moments from the past. His look at her during interviews, the way he defended her from rumors, the way his tone softened when he said her name. Every detail suddenly made sense, but what shocked people most wasn't just the admission, it was the rawness in his voice, the unfiltered pain in his eyes. It wasn't the voice of a man playing a part. It was the voice of someone who had finally stopped pretending, and as the cameras kept rolling, everyone watching could feel it, the story between Yaman and the woman he couldn't forget wasn't over. Not yet. After that emotional interview, silence surrounded Yaman once again, but this time, it wasn't the same kind of silence. It wasn't born out of pride or distance, it was filled with reflection, nostalgia, and a touch of regret. Those who know him personally say he withdrew for several days, canceling public appearances and choosing solitude. For someone constantly under the spotlight, it was unusual, but perhaps necessary. Behind closed doors, Can revisited old memories. The photos, the letters, the late-night calls that once defined their connection. People close to him say that during this quiet time, he often listened to old songs they used to share, melodies that spoke of love lost and the impossible urge to go back. "He doesn't show it," said one close friend, "but he's still living in that chapter. He never turned the page." Meanwhile, the internet was on fire. Fans all over the world analyzed every word, every look, every gesture from that interview. Many noticed the trembling in his voice when he mentioned her. Others pointed out that he still wore a certain bracelet, one that fans remember seeing years ago, during the time he and his ex were inseparable. It was subtle, but it said more than any public statement ever could. Journalists tried to reach her, to get her side of the story. Would she respond? Would she finally say something after all these years of silence? Her team initially refused to comment, but soon after, a cryptic post appeared on her social media: "Some stories never end, they just find new ways to breathe." It was enough to reignite the frenzy. Within minutes, hashtags trended worldwide. Fans began to hope again. Inside Can's circle, everyone knew the truth: he had always kept that chapter of his life sacred. It wasn't about publicity or nostalgia, it was about something that once felt real and pure, something that fame could never replace. "He's not the same when her name comes up," another close friend revealed. "He smiles, but it's the kind of smile that hides pain. You can see he still carries her with him." Even during his latest projects, people noticed subtle signs. In his new interviews, his answers grew more emotional, more reflective. Gone was the overly confident actor who used to brush off questions with a joke. Now, there was a man who had learned what love costs, and what it means to lose it. When asked if he would ever give love another chance, Kim paused for a long moment before answering. "Love never really leaves," he said softly. "Sometimes, it just changes form. Sometimes, it becomes a memory you keep alive in your heart." Those words once again sent fans spiraling. Could he be hinting at something? Was he waiting for reconciliation, or simply admitting that part of him will always belong to her? Whatever the truth may be, one thing became clear: the fire between them, though buried under time and pride, was far from extinguished. In the days following his heartfelt confession, Yaman's world changed in ways he hadn't expected. The media couldn't stop talking about it, every headline screamed his words, every entertainment outlet analyzed the possible meaning behind his tone, his expressions, even his silences. But beneath all the noise, something deeper was happening. Ken himself was beginning to confront feelings he had buried for too long. For years, he had been running from interviews, from emotions, from the vulnerability that came with loving someone too deeply. His fame grew, his projects multiplied, but his heart never really healed. That night after the interview, as he sat alone in his apartment, he replayed the entire moment in his head. Every question, every word, every pause. And when he heard his own voice saying, "I never stopped loving her," he realized it wasn't just a slip of emotion, it was the truth he had been carrying inside all along. Friends say he barely slept. Instead, he went for long walks through the quiet streets of Rome, where he's been living for months. The city lights reflected on the wet cobblestones, and the sound of distant laughter reminded him of the past, of the days when love felt effortless. It was said that he even stopped at a small cafe they used to visit together while filming abroad, sitting quietly by the window, lost in thought. Back in Istanbul, her name was trending again. She, too, had seen the interview. According to people close to her, she was moved, perhaps even shaken. She didn't expect it, one insider said. They haven't spoken in a long time. But when she heard his words, she cried. That one moment, 6 words, reopened a wound she had worked hard to close. She had built walls around herself, convincing the world she was strong, independent, unbothered. Yet hearing him speak so honestly reminded her of the connection they once shared, the laughter on set, the arguments that ended in tears, the long drives after filming when the world felt theirs alone. Fans began noticing something strange. She started liking old posts again, subtle interactions that didn't go unnoticed. In one old photo of them together from years ago, the comments section suddenly filled with thousands of hearts, as if the entire world was silently rooting for them to find their way back. Can, however, remained silent after that day. No statements. No clarifications. Just silence. But his silence spoke volumes. Insiders claimed he was writing again, something personal, perhaps a letter, perhaps a script, something that allowed him to put into words what his heart couldn't forget. He once said in an old interview, "When love is real, you don't need to speak. It echoes, even in silence." And now, it seemed those words had come back to haunt him. For the first time in a long while, Ken wasn't afraid of being vulnerable. Maybe because he had already lost the one thing that mattered most, and now, all he had left was the truth. Weeks passed, but the echo of Ken's confession refused to fade. Every entertainment outlet kept replaying that moment, "I never stopped loving her," over and over again, as if those words had become a part of pop culture themselves. But for Ken, it wasn't about headlines or trends anymore. It was about facing what he had avoided for too long, closure, or maybe, one last chance. He had learned through fame that not all stories get a second act. Sometimes, life separates people not because they stop loving each other, but because the world becomes too loud for love to survive in silence. Yet, something inside him whispered that their story wasn't truly finished. One night, after weeks of self-reflection, Ken was seen leaving a quiet restaurant in Rome. Paparazzi cameras flashed as he entered his car, but what caught everyone's attention wasn't his outfit or his expression, it was the small envelope he carried. Fans speculated endlessly. Was it a letter? A script? Or something meant for her? Back in Istanbul, sources close to his ex confirmed she had received something unexpected, a handwritten note. No one knows exactly what it said, but one insider revealed it began with the words, "You were right, love doesn't end when we say goodbye." That single line set the internet ablaze. Could this be the beginning of something new? Meanwhile, Ken retreated from the public eye again, focusing on his charity work and filming schedule. But those around him noticed he was different, calmer, softer, more grounded. "He's finally letting his heart guide him," a friend said. "For years he tried to protect his image. Now he's protecting his peace." During a fan event in Milan, a woman asked him if he believed in destiny. Ken smiled, took a breath, and replied, "I believe that when two people share something real, the universe will always find a way to bring them face to face again, maybe not as lovers, maybe not as before, but in a way that reminds them who they truly are." The audience fell silent. It wasn't just an answer, it was a message. His ex, too, began opening up in subtle ways. During a magazine interview, she was asked about love and forgiveness. Her reply was simple yet powerful: "Sometimes forgiveness is love's last form." The entire world interpreted it as her indirect response to Can's words. Fans across Italy and Turkey flooded social media with hope, edits, tributes, videos of their old scenes. It was as if the public wanted to rewrite fate itself, to see two souls finally find their way back after years of distance, but whether they would meet again or not remained a mystery. What was certain, however, was this: the love between them had never truly died. It had simply transformed, from passion to memory, from memory to longing, and from longing to something eternal. And in that transformation, Yaman found what he had been missing all along: not fame, not applause, but peace with the truth that had haunted him for years. Months later, the world had moved on, or so it seemed. New projects, new headlines, new faces filled the entertainment pages. But for those who had followed Yaman's story, one question never faded: did he ever see her again? Ken had grown quieter in recent months, not because he was hiding, but because he had finally learned to live with what his heart already knew. The noise around him, the gossip, the constant speculation, had become meaningless. What mattered now was authenticity. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of being honest, even if it made him vulnerable. On a chilly evening in late autumn, Ken was spotted walking along the Bosphorus, wearing a dark coat, his hands tucked into his pockets. It was the city where everything began, and perhaps, where something would end. Witnesses said he stopped at a familiar spot near the water, where years ago, he and his ex had shared one of their last quiet moments before fame took them in different directions. That night, Istanbul felt like a memory. The air was heavy, the lights from the bridge reflected off the waves like fragments of the past. He stayed there for nearly an hour, alone, looking out at the horizon. Some say he made a phone call. Others claim he was simply lost in thought. But what happened next would become the story that once again captured millions of hearts. Days later, fans noticed that both Can and his ex had posted at the same time, different photos, different captions, but the same exact quote: "There's no right time to say goodbye to a love that never ended." It was subtle, poetic, and deliberate. Within hours, social media exploded. The world wanted answers. Had they met? Was this coincidence, or a quiet message meant only for each other? An Italian magazine reported that the two were seen briefly at a private event in Rome, not as a couple, but as two people finally at peace. According to witnesses, their exchange was short, no drama, no tension. Just a look, a smile, and a quiet goodbye. One insider described it as a moment where two souls finally forgave each other without saying a word. For Can, that was enough. He no longer needed to explain his feelings to anyone. He had carried her in his heart through every role, every interview, every sleepless night. What once felt like a wound now felt like a part of who he was. Love doesn't always end with a storybook ending, he told a friend later. Sometimes, love ends by teaching you who you were meant to be. Still, that final meeting changed him. Those around him said he began to write again, not about pain this time, but about peace, closure, and the kind of love that matures rather than fades. Some even believe that his upcoming project, a romantic drama set in Italy, is inspired by that chapter of his life. When asked about it during an interview, Ken smiled gently and said, I think every actor hides a part of his truth in the stories he tells. Maybe that's my way of keeping certain memories alive. But perhaps the most touching moment came months later, when he was on stage during a live appearance. A fan shouted, "Do you still love her?" The crowd gasped. Ken looked out into the audience, visibly emotional, and after a brief pause, he replied softly, "Real love doesn't need to end for it to matter. It just changes shape." The audience erupted into applause. But Ken's eyes gave away something deeper, the quiet sadness of a man who had made peace with his past, even if a small part of his heart would forever belong to someone he could never forget. Later that night, as he left the venue and got into his car, he took one last look at the cheering crowd and whispered something under his breath. No one could hear it, but those close to him swear they saw his lips form the words, "Thank you, for still believing." And maybe that's what this story was really about, not fame, not heartbreak, but belief. Belief that some loves, no matter how far apart they drift, will always find their place in time, because for Ken Yaman, love was never about possession. It was about connection, the kind that doesn't fade with distance or fame. The kind that stays, quietly, in the spaces between words and memories. And so, as the world continued to speculate, Ken walked forward, not as the heartbroken actor everyone pitied, but as a man who finally understood that the greatest love stories are not always the ones that last forever, but the ones that never truly end.